Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations, where we almost have the full team again this week. Sam is unable to be with us, but we do have Dr. Glenn Wilson, we have John Mackay, we have Craig Hawkins, Dr. Diane Eager, and myself, as we do not deal with the advertised topic. Because we've got a backlogged topic. You will know that a couple of weeks ago we had our program live at the convention, which was slightly different. And then last week, when it was just me, we played John's research program. And this week we're actually going back to last week's topic, which is looking at population statistics. However, all of this will be organized on YouTube with correct titles and stuff like that sometime later this week. Sam's going to get onto that for us, so it'll all be organised back to how it should be. But for now, this evening, or this morning, or this wherever you are, we're going to be dealing with population statistics and the age of the Earth, including some aspects that perhaps you haven't quite heard of before. In fact, some of us even on the panel hadn't fully looked into some of the topics we're going to deal with tonight. So we're grateful to Glenn, who's going to be bringing us a rather interesting angle on population statistics. But it'll be a great program nonetheless. And thank you all for everybody who has come in with the questions as well. That's fantastic. And for the comments and stuff already, we're keeping a record of things, and we will get onto some of those a little bit later, or indeed we will cover them on a Q&A special in a week or two's time. But we do have the whole team here, which is great. And we're going to go over to Craig first this evening, who is going to give us a little bit of an update about some of the ministry that he's been on and some of the discoveries that he's made in the last little while. So, Craig, over to you.
Yeah, g'day everyone, and g'day chatsters. Yeah, it's great to be back, and just a little bit of a summary of what we've been doing on the Creator King road trip around the central eastern states and then down the coast now. So I'll just put a quick slide up there if I can. Joe, is that there to put up? Wonderful. So that's where we've been so far. Basically the red lines are where we've travelled, and the black triangles are where we've spoken and done a few other things. Got up to Winton, where the dinosaur fossils are well known from that region, and now we're down in the Gloucester Stroud area, which is a bit of my home country actually. So it's great to be back here with family and sharing at the churches here. We went, while we've been in Gloucester, to the west is the Barrington Tops National Park, and we went there, but just a few of the fossils we found along the way. At Winton, a beautiful piece of petrified wood, or a fossil wood actually. There's another one down in Stroud that we found the other day on a railway cutting. This one's just a little bit east of where I am at the moment. Really big slab, really doesn't give you the proportions there on the trolley. Basically can't lift that one, but it's absolutely chock-a-block of these crinoid fossils, and you can show that they've been catastrophically dumped, and it's a great fossil. That's another one we found on the southern tips of the Barrington Tops National Park. There's another one you can't really get the perspective of, but this one's from north of where we are just at the moment. A big slab of, it almost looks like you could split it with an axe, but that is very heavy. You can barely lift it. And it's a big piece of petrified timber. And that'll all go into the museum. And you can just see this stuff is scattered all over the countryside. When we're up at the National Park, there's a bunch of signs. I'll just share a couple of them with everybody just now. But you can see in that second paragraph there, and the last sentence, that wilderness provides a refuge where plants and animals can survive and evolve, largely free of the impacts of humans and introduced species. And that actually is a reflection of the mentality that our conservation organisations and even the privately run wilderness society have is that the reason we need wilderness areas is so that things can keep evolving. In fact, the Wilderness Society says this on their website, that they are a not-for-profit organisations whose principal purpose is to protect, promote and restore wilderness and natural processes for the survival and ongoing evolution of life on Earth. So it just shows you that your underlying worldview drives so much of what you do and the way you think and the way you manage things. Here's another sign, interesting sign, that I thought the team, especially John being an expert in coal, might like to comment on, that the sphagnum moss swamps up on the Barrington Tops are a good example of where peat moss is formed. Not that I think there's much peat moss, to my knowledge, up on the Barrington Tops. We've got peat moss down in Tasmania on the mountains. But John has said to me that sphagnum usually always grows in cool areas, which is actually true to my experience. It always grows in the cooler mountain areas of where I've worked. And it goes on to say that that takes thousands of years to become peat, and then tens of thousands of years for that peat to turn into coal. So maybe John can make a comment about that in a moment. But I'm sure, but this is probably one of the best signs I think I've seen on evolution. The fact that jellyfish has survived for 65 million years despite not having brains gives hope to many people.
The evolutionists can speak for themselves.
Exactly. Anyway, this is just a picture. We might refer back to this during our discussions on populations, but this green plant, this is up under the snow gum forest on the mountains we visited earlier this week. And that green plant is Scotch broom, called Scotch because it's from Scotland. It's an introduced plant and has actually taken over thousands and thousands of hectares on the Barrington Tops. And Australia's full of sort of various weeds in different places that are taking over because they've been introduced from other parts of the world. And most parts of the world experience this to some degree, especially now that it's such a world where people get around and move things around. But you can see a bit more of the Scotch broom there, but also these horses. And the horses are actually a feral problem in a lot of our national parks. Apparently just the Barrington Tops National Park's relatively small, but there's about 500 or more feral horses. There's also a lot of problems with pigs. The pigs are chewing up the swamps and digging them up. So you can come back to us now, Joe, but it's just an interesting point to make because after the flood, there would have been a lot of niches in ecosystems that needed to be filled. And when creatures were first getting out there, they're filling those niches and their populations can explode. So the pigs have got no real competitors up there on the Barrington Tops. I mean, the wombats are up there digging around a little bit as well, but there's no way they can compete with the pigs. And the horses are the biggest mammal by a long shot in that area. There's a few grey kangaroos, but they're really starting to get to proportions that need to be controlled.
Okay, Craig, I'll comment since you dobbed me in there. Having travelled all over the world, including Florida, which has got some of the biggest swamps on the planet, you don't find any peat on the bottom of the swamps. In fact, you find just white shells 99.9% of the time, plus a few alligators that you need to watch out for when you're doing research there. So number one, in the tropical areas that I've travelled, you find no accretion, no build-up of peat swamps. Having got a Scottish heritage, I've wandered all over the north of Scotland, which is full of peat swamps, because peat forms when there is less decay in winter than there is build-up in the summertime. So the rapid growth in the 10 or 12 weeks of warm summer in Scotland is never lost in the next winter. So every year it builds up a little bit. In fact, I came across one deposit where the trees had obviously been barraged down by a bulldozer ice sheet, and they were still on the bottom underneath the peat, and the peat had grown over the top as the cold of the ice had been replaced by just bogs. So peat swamps are characteristic, as you said, on colder areas like the top of Tasmania. And they never, if you go looking in coal, I have to really work hard to even try and find deposits of moss in coal, because sphagnum moss is not an ingredient in coal formation at all. Most coal is made of pine bark, made of branches, made of stuff that is usually associated with Australia or South America or England when it was warmer. So your coal statements are pure evolutionary indoctrination. So tragic, but true. They've lied to us at the best because they're ignorant, but in most cases, as you saw, it was a stated aim of a not-for-profit organisation, which obviously the government approves of to give them tax deductibility status. It's tragic, but funded evolution is ruining our national parks. I liked your horses you showed, Craig, and if anybody's visiting Tasmania, they should go to the little town outside of Launceston where Mr. Brumby is buried. Brumby, by the way, is the name us Aussies call wild horses, and the reason is because of a horse owner in Tasmania who was pretty careless with his gates, and he was always known for having Mr. Brumby's horses wandering all over the place. And so here in Queensland, where we have lots of wild horses too, we call them Brumbies. But he's buried in a churchyard, an Anglican churchyard, not far away from where you are, Craig. So going to Tasmania, visit and have a look at some of these historic characters who've left their name in our Aussie history. But I've got a question for you, Craig, because I saw on your graph, your travel graph, that you came from Tasmania across a water area and then over onto the mainland. Now, I remember flying home once from Launceston in Qantas, and as we sort of began to land in Melbourne, the hostess said, "Welcome to Australia." Now, and then she corrected herself. I mean, welcome to the mainland, right? Now, this is a common belief that Tasmania is a different country than Australia, but there are some differences. Now, you and I were talking yesterday about getting that big fossil block home. Now, you said you'd have to go through customs. Now, explain what's happening there, Craig. Why does Tasmania have its customs bureau at the end of the ferry ride?
Well, I guess it's because we're an island and there's certain things we don't have down there. Some of the soil diseases carried in soils. We don't have fruit flies, for example. We don't have a bunch of other problems with, for example, bees. On the mainland, there's the varroa mite has escaped in Australia, which is a real tragedy for our honey industry. But in Tasmania, we've got an important honey industry, for example, and those mites aren't in our state, so they want to keep them out. So we've got our own border protection, if you like, around the island, and we've got to be careful with what we take back in with regards fossils. But they're rocks; they're not soil as such. So we've given them good cleaning. We've sprayed them down with bug spray and cleaned them with anti-mold and all sorts of things. So hopefully they'll get through, no problems.
Yeah, that's good. I've had the same problem bringing fossils from overseas, particularly from South America, where you don't find too many peat swamps in the jungles. You find the swamps, but if the plants are going to be accreted, then it has to have a particular environment, like a big flood, to build up huge fossil wood deposits that are rapidly buried. Otherwise, it doesn't get preserved. And I'm sure, Glenn, you've been to the Everglades a lot of times. Have you personally found any peat on the bottom of the Florida Everglades?
No, and you don't find pine trees either. They're an upland tree. They don't like the swamps.
That's right.
One of the things that I've really found incredible on this trip is just everywhere you go, the evolutionary indoctrination on signs. And I've just given a couple of examples of many dozens of photos that I've taken of these sorts of signs throughout the national park, as well as museums and other places. And it's just an incredible indoctrination that's going on. It's actually mind-boggling when you take note of it.
Okay, one last question on Tasmania for our listeners who are from outside of Australia. Tasmania obviously shows evidence of having been linked high and dry to the mainland of Australia, correct?
Tasmania has been, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so many creatures arrive there and are currently, that's the only place you find them. Can you name a couple? Because we're dealing with populations today.
Well, the Tasmanian devil is probably the best known example. There's a few other birds and things that are there that are the last remnants of creatures that have been known across Australia. The Tasmanian bettong is another example. The bettong was well known across Australia, even found in our lifetime on the mainland, but has largely become extinct. What's the bandicoot, the barred bandicoot, eastern barred bandicoot is another one, although they have found another little population in Victoria, Western Victoria. They refound it. So there's the eastern quoll is another one, supposedly extinct on the mainland now, but is still doing well in Tasmania. So the island isolation in the end has probably helped it survive things like foxes in particular. So foxes were introduced late and they couldn't get across the Bass Strait, which had come back over the land by the time the Europeans had arrived, and the foxes couldn't get across. So the lack of any real predator of that ability has allowed those small marsupials to survive.
Okay, one last comment from me, because one of my first fossils that I did a project on for the Queensland University when I was a student there was a thylacine. I found the fossils on the Darling Downs, you know, your Tasmanian tigers and all those sort of things. So they used to be widespread. I have a Tasmanian tiger sort of jaw from the caves in South Australia, and they only exist, if they still exist, in Tasmania, but certainly existed up to the 1930s. So in population sense, we've seen a real drop in population of many of these creatures in the mainland of Australia, and a survival rate in the island of Tasmania, which gets relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So perhaps if I take over, Joe, the subject today is population, and particularly human population will become very, very evident. But you've got to remember that the context we're dealing with is a biblical context. We make no apologies for that. The Bible is emphatic that man was created. And when you read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God said he made man in his image, and the first instruction was to multiply and fill the earth and to have dominion. Now, we live in a world where all those signs portray evolution and tell you to keep out, preserve this land so you can allow evolution. Now, the Bible says God gave the planet into our hands, and he also told us to multiply and fill the earth. So there's all sorts of questions that come up, and Diane and I will discuss them a bit later. Could we have ever filled the earth? What would happen if we were here for millions of years and overpopulated the planet? Because we live in Australia. And come on, Craig, answer this one last question, I guess, if we can have you back up on screen. As you've travelled all through the outback of Australia, how many overcrowded towns did you come across?
Yeah, very few.
That's right. I have one friend who lives out at Burke, and he runs his entire farm with robot tractors. They set up laser panels at either end of the thousands of acres and set the tractor on remote. The guy sits in there just in case anything goes wrong and listens to music on his Wi-Fi system. But the tractor runs itself because the land is so flat and so vast. It is no problem, and he doesn't come across any people, and he's not in trouble of running over any tourists at all. So Australia is largely empty. So we can vouch for the fact that despite all these evolutionary signs, A, nothing is evolving, and B, we could go on for thousands and thousands of years before we even reach crowd point. But of course, we do have a housing problem, and the housing problem is due to the fact that the government brings people in, doesn't allow for where they're going to live, and we are overcrowding the cities. Get that right? We are overcrowding the cities because most people don't want to move out and live in the country, particularly those people from already overcrowded places where they've got a background of living communally in India or Arabia or places like that. Okay, now Craig or Joe, can I have my slides up, please?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll just,
Okay.
we'll get them up now.
Yeah. All right, so there we are. Whoops, did that come up? Yes, there we are. Whoops, I need to be back there. That's right. Okay, I've listed this first section as 7 billion problems with an old Earth, because you and I will have noticed from those signs and from any regular watching, it is a very common view that we've had millions, if not billions of years for microbes and eventually people to overcrowd everywhere. All right, now why this topic? It's because when I was a student at university and doing genetics as well as on top of geology, we had a professor who was puzzled by a particular problem. It was this one. Oops, why aren't I moving, Joe?
Remember, you need to bring up your own PowerPoint on your screen.
Oh, right, okay, that might help. Yep. All right, there we are. And it was this graph. Okay, notice the 10,000 BC, notice the 2000, notice the AD, where Jesus Christ appears on the planet, then AD 1000, AD 2000. And of course, the professor was telling us that we were on the edge of not far away from overcrowding the planet. But you'll have a look at the rest of the graph, because the population increase doesn't seem to be started much until about 4000 BC at the most on his graph. Now, let's explain this. He was emphatic that we had to learn that equation. Now, I'll be honest, I've forgotten even how to do some of these sort of equations, but I got distinctions in genetics, so I did know how to do it once. P is population alive today, roughly 7 billion. C is half the number of children per family. X is generations alive today. And those of you who know mathematicians who ponder about all these things, they actually mess around until they find equations that work and describe. So that equation there really is a short version of what we've discovered about how populations work. And N is the total number of generations. Now, you'll see at the bottom I've got my source, Ian Taylor, In the Minds of Men. He's actually got his whole book, the Minds of Men, that he brought out as the first really historic book on creationism. It's filed on our website. Go look for it. Ian was a great guy. He's gone to be with the Lord now, but he had a different approach to the whole creation evolution area that dealt with history. What happens to populations? Well, here's how it works. When you have what's called ZPG, each parent has only one child to replace it. So 2 parents become 2 parents, become 2 parents, become 2 parents, become 2 parents. And the end result is no real growth in population. A family of 2 stays 2, assuming nobody dies, of course, because that's fatal to ZPG. But ZPG is what many people are aiming for at the moment. They want the population reduced, and you get all your conspiracy theories involving diseases and use of immunizations and all of that to reduce the population, or war. War is a convenient way, according to many of these people, for keeping the population low. Now, on the other hand, history tells us that if you start with 2 people and they have 4 children, and those 4 children have 2 children each, then sooner or later you end up with what's called exponential growth. Because the 2 people who started this, well, take me, my example, my wife and I, we have a total of 18 descendants. Her mother had a total of about 25 descendants. The population has increased. So when you look at this graph that our professor brought our attention to, 4000 BC, by the time you get up to 2075, according to the graph when he was presenting it, there was roughly 9.2 billion people. Now, I suspect there may be going to be more than that, but in 2000 AD, there was 6.1 billion people, and we lived through that, and all of the kerfuffle that was going with the change into the new millennium, etc. You'll see I've listed the Black Death as areas where the population dropped. Now, why am I telling you this? These graphs are interesting because that formula I gave you, according to the professor, it works regardless of the number of wars, regardless of the number of abortions, regardless of number of murders, etc. Now, here was his puzzle. You see, he was an evolutionist, and he was openly admitting as an expert on genetics that he didn't have a clue genetically how evolution could occur. He knew how population could decrease by death and things like that and die, and I will talk about that a bit later. But what puzzled him was if we've been here for 7 billion years, if humans have been on the planet for 3 million years, then how come we had ZPG right up to about 4,000 years ago? Because that is the history of the planet. He couldn't figure that out. Well, I'll tell you what, the Bible's got a better suggestion, particularly in our opinion, that the world's population restarted from 8 people on a big boat, largely 3 reproducing couples, Noah's 3 sons and their wives. No evidence Noah ever had any kids after the flood. But then again, he was already nearly 600 years old. So who wants kids when you're 600 years old? If we started 4,500 years ago from 3 families, which had 2.5 children only, and life expectancy was only 43, then according to Ian Taylor and all the mathematicians I've talked to, that's an accurate representation. Around 7 billion people would be the result from 3 families. Now, the reality is there are roughly 7 billion people when this graph was first put down. So the calculations based on the Bible picture are accurate. 3 families at the time of Noah's flood, and 7 billion people at the time the calculation was finally put together. And there is the problem. I mean, this is the problem that the professor listed as an evolutionist, as someone who obviously knew what the Bible had to say because he'd been raised in the old-fashioned Oxford-Cambridge tradition where there was a Christian framework to thinking, but it was abandoned because of evolution. If man began to multiply 3 million years ago, 2 hairy ape-like creatures crawled out of the trees in Africa, began to stand upright and have multiplying children, more than 2 at a time, so there was not ZPG. How come we end up with ZPG for most of the history of mankind? Now, that's a background to the introduction on population statistics. My comment, what you find is that mankind's population on the planet at the moment far better fits the biblical framework of time, far better fits the biblical history of a population drop at the time of Noah's flood. How many people were on the planet at that time is a good question. God offered them all room on Noah's Ark, so I suspect there wasn't a huge number, but only 3 families, 3 reproducing families survived. Okay, we'll come back to us now, Joe. When I bring up your system here. Okay, you got me up there again, Joe?
Yep, all good.
Yep.
John, don't they say that, don't the evolutionists say that there's been lots of mass extinction events or mass sickness and wipeout events to try and explain it?
They certainly do, but you can't point to that with human beings. I mean, we have a few things like mass death at the Black Plague and all of that, but when you look at the historic documents, and it's not just the Bible that records this, all of the kings counted their people because it was a boasting point. Here's how big our army is. I'll send them all if you don't give in straight away. So we've got population data for the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, even recorded in secular history, and there's not one single mass event which eliminates population growth at all. It's certainly true. Glenn's going to talk about it later in what I call a mammoth job on population, because some of this certainly seems to work for animals. So human beings coming to the mainland of Australia with the Aborigines from India certainly seems to have resulted in demise of animals to point zero. We ate them all. I mean, we find dingo fossils in China, and the reason why they're not there today is they probably all got eaten at the local restaurant. But who knows? We've got important stuff on population of animals and demise to zero, but no such effect on human beings. Joseph, you're going to take over now with the Cyrus cylinder and a few other comments on biblical history. So away you go, mate.
Yeah, so John's dealt a little bit with some of the statistics, okay, the maths, in regards to population levels. Glenn's going to talk a little bit later about some of the animals and mammoths and elephants and stuff. But if we just go to the Bible for a moment, and we've got a brand new artifact here, just arrived at the Creation Research Centre. It's a cast, it's not an original. That's because the original is basically priceless, and in the British Museum. And in fact, the cast turned out, the official one done by the British Museum, turned out to be a bit more expensive than we could afford as well. So we're grateful that the Lord has provided this for us at a fantastically reasonable price to be able to put on our display. It's actually the Cyrus cylinder, as it's known as, Cyrus the Great Freedom Cylinder. It's on display in the British Museum in London in the UK. It's cuneiform. Cuneiform is that ancient written version of the Akkadian language, the language of the Chaldeans, used by the Sumerians through the Assyrians, through the Babylonians, and into the Persians. And it records the first real ever time of some diplomacy, if you like, where Cyrus the Great allowed the children of Israel to go back into the promised land. Remember, this is post-captivity. You've got the children of Israel, they're living, they get split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Israel has the worst track record out of the two, and they get taken by the Assyrians. And then a few years later, Judah gets taken, or Judea gets taken by the Babylonians. They go into captivity, Daniel in the lion's den. There's your context, okay? And then Cyrus the Great, first time a king has ever done such a thing, he allows the children of Israel to go back to the promised land, to not only set up their houses and so on and so forth, but to actually reestablish the priesthood, reestablish a foreign to the King Cyrus anyway, religion, and reestablish it back in the promised land, as the biblical prophecy said would happen. And critics of the Bible, denied that such a thing would ever happen, because no king would ever do that, until they actually found the cylinder which said that he did indeed do that. Okay, what's the real significance of this, and what's the connection with population statistics? Okay, well, two aspects of this return from captivity are detailed in the Bible. The first one is Nehemiah, okay, rebuilding the walls and re-establishing the city of Jerusalem. The second one is Ezra. Ezra was assigned by God to re-establish the priesthood when they came back into the promised land. And what does this have to do with population statistics? Well, Ezra chapter 2, I've got my Bible in front of me here. Ezra chapter 2, verses 60 to 63 has an interesting reference to just how important God actually takes statistics, or rather, God actually takes legitimacy of lineages. I mean, let me ask you a question. Where can you read about the king Cyrus sending the children of Israel back to the promised land? The answer is in the Old Testament. And of course, Old Testament, New Testament, as in last will and testament, we're dealing with God's legal dealings with mankind, whether it's with the children of Israel under the Old Covenant, or us, the Gentiles, drafted in to God's salvation plan under the New Covenant. But you'll find that the same thread of salvation, which is Jesus Christ, goes through both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and God takes legitimacy rather seriously. I mean, that's why it's a testament, right? It's a last will and testament. It's a detail about a man who has to die in order to bring salvation. That man also needs to be God. Now, have a look at what it says in Ezra chapter 2, verses 60 to 63. It says, and the children of the priests, remember, Ezra has come to set up the priesthood once again in the promised land, right? Re-establish the priesthood. The priesthood, as in the Levites, right? The people who had to prove that they were from a certain tribe in order to actually be part of the priesthood. And the children of the priests, Habbai, Koz, and Barzillai, they sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they as polluted, put from the priesthood. In other words, because these three men had no ability to prove exactly who they were. They had effectively lost their, grandfather's birth certificate. They had one missing link at some point during the captivity. They had lost the information that proved that they were legitimately able to be priests. And so it says, therefore, they were as polluted, put out from the priesthood. You see, just one missing link was enough to remove these three men from the priesthood and to be able to cast them aside completely. And then if you go to the book of Hebrews, you read about our great high priest, who is Jesus Christ. You see, there are laws in the book of the Levites, the Leviticus book, right? The book of the Levitical law, if you like, which talks about things like inheritance, and it talks about things like redemption and how you must be related to the person that you're redeeming. And you find that in the New Testament, we get confirmation of this in the sense that we will be co-heirs with Christ, we will be adopted into Christ's family, and all of this stuff is all legal terms. And Paul makes the specific point that it is dependent on the death of a testator. That testator, by the way, is Jesus Christ. Okay, it's dependent on the death of Jesus Christ. What has this got to do with population statistics? Well, you see, when you open up your Bible and you read that so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so until you fall asleep, you have to ask yourself the question, what are they actually there for? What are the genealogies and the chronologies really there for? Now, they're not just confused the first time, coming to church when he gets asked to read out of the Bible. They're actually there for a very important and very legitimate reason. You see, they're there to prove who Jesus Christ actually is. He is legitimately and legally descended from Adam. You see, if he wasn't, there would be no guarantee of our salvation, because you see, the person who is coming to do the redemption according to God's law must be descended and related from the people that he's coming to save. In other words, Christ had to be related to us. That's why if you look in the genealogies in the New Testament, I think it's in Luke, where it describes him as Adam as the Son of God. It starts with Adam, the Son of God, all the way down until you get to Jesus, who is legitimately descended from Adam, therefore can legitimately be our Savior, be our redeemer. And you see, he can provide redemption, and we can become co-heirs with Christ. We can be adopted into God's family because he is related to us. Now, where does this all go from population statistics? Well, you see, there are many people who like to try and argue that, you see, there are gaps in the genealogies, or there are issues with the genealogies and the chronologies. And, well, the reality is, if there were any gaps, we would have no real reason to be able to accept Christ as our legitimate Savior. You see, according to Levitical law, he would have to be put out as polluted. You see, the genealogies are there to prove who Christ is, and when you count the genealogies up, you end up with an age of the earth between 6,000 to 7,000 years old, which fits perfectly with the data that we actually see in the real world, such as some of the statistics that John has been giving you. So you see, both from a biblical point of view, as well as from a, suppose you could call it a mathematical point of view, the population statistics actually lines up with the Bible pretty well indeed. And it's actually artifacts like this which really do show that the Bible can be trusted, and it's that logic that Paul explains in books like the book of Romans, right? And the author of Hebrews goes into detail about it as well, which relies on Jesus Christ being descended from Adam, being 100% man, 100% God, completely related to us, and actually dying to take our punishment on the cross. Well, John, I'll hand back to you now, and give me a couple of minutes while I check out the chat, because it might be a good time to go to some questions. But any comments from you?
It is a good time to go to questions, because I see they're building up there, but we'll take those in a moment. After the question time, Glenn's going to come and deal with animal populations, and a most intriguing thing dealing with after the flood amongst the animals. And then Diane and I will come on in the last segment dealing with how long can we live, how do we die, why do we die, can we ever overpopulate the planet, etc. But getting back to the point Joseph made, we've got a document, not just the Bible records, but the stuff from Cyrus, who the Bible says was a king that God appointed so that this would deliberately happen. And it says Cyrus, who did not even know my name. So when you are dealing with the God of the Bible, you're dealing not only with a God who knows everything, but who is willing to put into position of power someone who doesn't even know they're being used, and use them mightily to restore his plan. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend how you could actually run history like this and give people enough will to think they've got a free will, because we don't have total free will, no matter what you might think. We have limited free will at the best, right? And we have a God who's got an overriding plan, which is why when you become a Christian, I'd encourage you to really do what Jesus said. Pray this way, he told the disciples, our Father in heaven, your will be done. You are handing your choices over to God as sovereign to be used for his sake. So, Joe, you should be ready now to actually deal with the chat and give thank yous, etc. And again, for those of you who wanted to know, Sam isn't with us tonight.
Yeah, so I'm looking after stuff on my own, so apologies if I miss things or don't see things. Remember, it always helps to put a Q in front of your question before it goes up so that I can see it quicker and easier. But we do have a thank you for Douglas Boffey for £5. We have a thank you as well to Fiorella. So thank you very much indeed. I think that's all the thank yous, but if I've missed, I will go back over and check in a little bit. We do have a couple of questions as well. We'll start with one from Douglas Boffey. What is your response rather to the accusation that the world is overpopulated, which we briefly commented on earlier with Australia? But any comments, guys?
Well, I'll make again a repeat of it, and then you can take over, Craig. I have trekked through Canada. I have flown right from east to west. I've gone up into Alaska and done field trips and nary meet a person. I found one abandoned toilet in the wilds of Alaska with 2 boots beside it made out of duct tape. So I know that duct tape makes good boots. I just don't know what happened to the guy's body or why he built a toilet in the middle of nowhere. It was really interesting. But the miners did some strange things and have almost vanished without trace in those wild wildernesses. So you'll find that there are many places that are totally zero population in the world today. It's the cities that tend to be overpopulated, and regretfully, people want to live in cities, and governments tend to allow them because there's more income if they get them all together and they can charge them more and more. So it's not the world that's overpopulated. It's many of our city areas where people want work and government comfort and sponsorship. Craig?
Oh, look, I was just going to say what we said before. If you think it's overpopulated, yeah, go out of the cities. Get out into the wild areas. Go and look at outback Australia. It's not overpopulated. Drive for a long time and not see anyone.
I'd like to say something from an agriculture background. Working in agriculture for 40 years, it's a matter of your definition of overpopulated. From our perspective, it's for how much food can you produce, because there's certainly plenty of room for more people. And the question is, how much can the world produce? Can we feed everybody? The concerns I have is there's organizations that are very concerned about, can we produce more food? And of course, then they want to do that while protecting the environment. But some of these organizations are going out and buying the prime agriculture land and putting in solar farms. Well, that's accomplishing just the opposite of what they're wanting to do. If you want to put in solar farms, maybe you should strategically place them on areas that can't produce. A good example, drive across the Mississippi. Some of the most productive land in America is the Mississippi River alluvium, and you'll see that land's taken out of agriculture production for solar farms. So you're going to produce less food. So, from that perspective also, I think we're down to less than 2% of the population is actually involved in agriculture production. as John said, people want to live in the city. They don't want to be out there producing the food. So what is your definition of overpopulated? If it's based upon how much food you produce, or is it based on how much room that we have? Because we certainly have plenty of room for more people.
And
Glenn,
sorry.
I asked a professor from Vanderbilt University what he thought about the population of the world, and I was surprised when he came back with this answer. He said, well, if you took everybody on the planet, and this is roughly 20 years ago at the moment, he said you could stand them 1 meter apart so they could swing their arms around, and he said you'd fit them all on Rhode Island. And it hasn't changed much. Of course, I had to remind them that if we took everybody on the planet, stood them 1 meter apart, we would need much better deodorants, which is really true. But we are way far from being overcrowded. We may be inefficient at agriculture,
Yes.
as Glenn implies. And like even on my property here, I delight on just my few acres in being able to go and get a chicken, being able to go and pick tomatoes, pumpkins, potatoes, etc., and actually feed ourselves. And in Australia after World War II, many of the soldiers were automatically, and this is World War I particularly, given 50 acres, and they were expected to survive. And if they had the skills, it was no trouble at all. Even my dog with canine teeth goes around digging up the potatoes that I miss and enjoys eating them. So a vegetarian world in the beginning is not a foolish idea at all. My dogs love that sort of stuff as well as grass. So when you look at the biblical history, it doesn't start out with an overcrowded planet. It starts out with two people who are told to multiply and fill the earth. And then after Noah's flood, God tells us we will have cold and heat. So the question we saw before about the environment in Alaska and Antarctica, etc., doesn't even become relevant till after Noah's flood, because we've seen that good to bad to worse progression we keep thumping on about, and will continue to do so if you want to understand some of the vagaries of the climate and population controls today. Anybody else?
Yeah, just to quickly add on to that and kind of tie both Glenn's comments and your comments together, one of the sort of the products, if you like, of a post-World War II world in the West, this is, where we live in a very commercialized and very easy to access food and let's face it, overall, or in a generalization, a sort of a lack of knowledge or understanding, particularly amongst younger people, as to where their food comes from or to and how it is produced and the like. If you look at some of the figures, globally, there's about 2.5 billion tons of food that goes to waste every year, which would be enough to feed about 3 billion people. Now, currently, if you look on the national statistics, which I think it's the states that produce it, there's about just shy of 1 billion people that are currently starving. So it's not so much about a lack of agriculture, it's also about how that food is distributed. Now, I'm not saying that socialism and communism is the correct way by any means, but you'll find that a lot of the times this starving kind of population is down to bad governments, it's down to bad management, even within a certain area. So take, for instance, Latin America, a lot of poor countries in Latin America, a lot of starving people in Latin America, and yet there's over 300 million tons of food that goes to waste there. So a lot of it is down to bad governments and bad management, even within a populace, and that's almost a completely separate issue from an overpopulation issue as well.
Yeah. Speaking of which, one of the first things agricultural development does is go in and puts in the infrastructure for being able to transport. And in South America, when they put in the roads, that opened up the cocaine business and it exploded.
Yeah.
So it's bad government, oftentimes mismanagement.
Yeah.
Yep.
Next question, Joe.
Yeah, just having a quick look. There's some more people coming in. Let's go to. Let's have another quick question from Douglas Boffey, which is on the similar veins, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions later, because we're going to go over to Glenn next, I believe.
Joe, there was a fair bit of discussion from a question from some other guy about genetic decline.
Let's have a look and see.
Yeah, mutation.
That will come up with Diane and I, Craig. So we might leave that one.
I'll go back and try and find that. Maybe just a quick comment on this question. What would the antediluvian population be?
Okay, the only comments I think you could make is that every one of them, except for 8 people, died at the time of the flood. The second comment you can make is God had told Eve to multiply and fill the earth, and they had done a moderate job, except you find one thing. In all the chronologies of the 10 generations from Adam through to Noah, there is not one big family listed. Now, when I say that, people get horrified because we're used to much bigger families than was the norm. I mean, you lived like Noah 500 years and you have 3 kids. You are not overcrowding the planet. When you live like Adam and Eve and you have 5, maybe 7 kids in 930 years, you are not overcrowding the planet. So the population expansion we see post-flood is much greater. It's like, guinea pigs. I'm sure guinea pigs have mass multiplied only after the flood, and our problem was starting with 2 guinea pigs and ending with thousands in your home, little guinea pigarium, are new problems to us because God told us more about population than most Christians think, and Diane and I will bring that up. So the population before Noah's flood, since God told Noah he could preach to everyone and offer them a seat on the ark if they were willing by faith to accept, nobody did, so we won't know for sure. But the implication is the ark was big enough to fit all willing people on that boat.
All right, good stuff. Thank you for that. Let's carry on then, and we'll come back to. I've got that genetic question that I found there earlier, Craig. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But for now, I think we're going over to Glenn, yes, for his program, which is on a very new topic. It's a good new topic that I don't think we've done before in creation research. So, Glenn, over to you.
All right, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see that now?
I can. It's just come up. Let me pull it up for you. There we go.
Okay. So we're going to talk about, John said the animals. We're going to talk about the woolly mammoth populations, and you'll see why in just a minute. So what were the conditions? What are the conditions for an ice age? Well, it's not caused by extreme cold. I think, Craig, you talked about this not too long ago. Extreme cold wouldn't have the moisture to produce snow. What you need is warm oceans pumping moisture into cold atmosphere. So what were the conditions after the flood? Well, we know mountains rose, the valleys sank, which would provide this differential heating. And John said you're going to have seasons of cold and summer. What else do we know? Well, you had these heated oceans, which would be pumping moisture into the atmosphere. We knew there was volcanoes just all over the world. And even today, volcanoes can cause a all-year winter that can last for 2 or 3 years. So all the dust in the atmosphere would block a lot of that solar radiation reaching the surface. So you would have prime conditions for moisture being pumped into an atmosphere that would be really cold. It's conditions suitable for an ice age. Well, there's been those, we've talked about this before. Michael Orr did some simulations of the weather, being that that's what his career was in. And it suggested that the ice age would occur for about the first 500 years after the flood, and maybe another 200 years of intermittent as it slowly ended and you had the melt. The reason I bring that up is we're going to talk about woolly mammoths. Woolly mammoths are essentially a adaptation from the elephant, or the elephant is from the woolly mammoths. We don't know what was taken on the ark, but they're just different from the elephants in that they have long hair, they have tiny tails and small ears. Again, an adaptation for winter cold conditions. And again, that is an indication of a loss of genetic information, not a generation of new genetic information. And what do we know? We know from excavations that there are a lot of woolly mammoths out there. One scientist, this Vareskin, said that there should be, from his estimates, about 5 million mammoths buried in Siberia alone. In the USA, we find them scattered all over America. So, given that woolly mammoths require such an extensive amount of food and water, 400 to 650 pounds of food daily, 35 to 50 gallons of water daily, and knowing that they started with 2 at the Ark, is it possible that you could have 5 million mammoths buried in Siberia alone? How do you get that many within just a few hundred years of the Ark? Is that possible? And then we'll talk about extinction as to what caused that as well. Well, what do we know from elephants? Well, we know there should have been of the elephant kind 2 that exited the Ark, and they only have one offspring every 5 years, and their lifespan today is up to about 80 years. Can you get that many animals? Well, if you start just looking at this chart and assuming that 50% of the offspring are females, means 50% males, and they have one every 5 years, up to 80 years, and assuming no death, no predators. Now that you may question, no predators. Well, you also had just 2 of each kind of predator exiting the Ark, and they were told to scatter to fill the earth, as John said. Plus, you would have had carcasses from the flood over the earth. It's a pretty good assumption. No predation for quite a long time. Well, if you look at this, after 10 years, you've only got 4. After 20 years, you've only got 8. And if you do the linear and extend it out, you would see at 300 years, at the peak of it, you would only have about 86 of these elephants, not 5 million. But the problem, as John said, is it's not linear growth. It's exponential growth because your offspring are reproducing. And if you add in the offspring reproducing as well, you find that you could get at 250 years, you could get up to the 5 million. At 300 years, you could get up close to 20 million. So yes, you can easily get that. This is just showing you how you could just do a very simple calculation. You could use the exponential model, but with all the offspring reproducing, it's like compounding interest. So again, you easily can get that many millions of mammoths by the middle of the Ice Age by simple calculations. The problem with this is, as I said, it's that it doesn't include predation. Keep in mind, they also find that it's just not just mammoths, that these areas of Siberia, the areas where there was this ice, had a wide diversity of animals, many that went extinct. So when I was in college working on my doctor's degree, I took a lot of math classes, a lot of engineering classes, but one of my favorite classes was mathematical modeling. And we did mathematical modeling of populations and predator prey. In the blue, you'd see the prey population would increase until there'd be a lag, and then the predator population increases. And when it does, then the prey population goes back down till it hits a minimum. Well, now the predator doesn't have anything to eat on, so it goes back down. And these cycles go on until you get to a carrying capacity out here at the end at some point, if there's no other factors. So he had us looking at populations of fish, particularly after World War II, when the men around certain islands where the men went off to war and there were no people fishing. And then you could look at the shark populations that they monitored and the fish populations. And we would do this type of modeling, which is very interesting. But what we see with them was it didn't continue this cycling, but their population went up and then went down to nothing. They went extinct. So there's some other factor you have to put into the model, besides just the predator-prey populations, which you can add in very easily. You can add in an exponential equation for the predators. Well, what was it? Well, it was most likely caused by a combination of things, but I think the main factor was climate change. Remember, we talked about how the oceans were warm from the flood, God breaking up the fountains of the deep, and you had all these thermal jets ejecting hot water into the waters. And the waters before the flood were likely much warmer as well because they were shallow seas instead of the oceans that we see today. But once that starts ending and it starts getting to a new equilibrium, you're not going to have the moisture pumped up. You're not going to be having the ice age continuing. Now you've got this animal that's adapted for very cold conditions, and you're moving into a period of warmer, drier atmosphere. And you've got all this frozen ground. It's going to be bare when it melts. And at that time, you're going to have extreme winds because you've got these cold areas over now drier atmosphere. Extreme winds, which causes dust storms. And Craig, you talked about this. So you're going to have not just a loss of the habitat, because the Siberian area was an area of extensive grasslands. And if you look in North America, just below where the glaciers were, it's where we have our black soils, which are made from grasslands. So it would have been a great environment for these types of our bison, but also the woolly mammoths that would turn colder in the winter and have these incredible grasslands to feed on during the summertime. Well, now those are going to be lost. So you're going to have a loss of food, loss of water. You've got all of this dust in the air, which is going to increase diseases with pathogens. And you're also still going to have the predator pressure. But you also have to remember that what was about 100 years after the flood that you had the Tower of Babel. So now you've got the dispersion, and you've got people dispersing, moving up into Siberia area where all of the mammoths are, going across to America. So you're also going to have hunting pressures. So you've got to add those into your equation: hunting pressure, disease pressures, and just loss of habitat. So the people populations, which were probably, as John's showing, increasing exponentially, migrate into these areas where you've got these high animal populations, and all these factors, I think, are what's going to go into causing you to lose the mammoths. So I thought you can go back to me, Joe. You can go back to me. I thought this was a good example of just the dynamics that populations can go through. That a population, and I think, Craig, you mentioned this earlier, after the flood, certain niches needed to be filled, and you have these great conditions for the woolly mammoths to just, their population to just explode. But climate change was the main factor, losing them, because with that climate change brought disease, brought more predation, and then eventually hunting. So that's
Are you back
all I
on,
have.
Joe?
Yeah, I'm back on. There we are.
I'd suggest, because Glenn's work is so new to most people, that we have a short question time now, and then Diane and I will roughly round the day off.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Let's start with this one earlier about the genetics, which sparked lots and lots of conversation, but I think this is where I've traced it back to. There's been lots of comments on it. But would the three families not have to have all genetic disorders, as mutations can't add genetic information? And it then went into a number of questions talking about where mutations come from, what are mutations? And one comment was, well, could evolution happen through mutations if given enough of deep time and so on and so forth? Or could sin have caused evolution given enough time? So maybe a few comments on mutations and what they can and can't do.
Diane?
Well, yes, we actually had a program about mutations a while ago, but in summary, mutations are any change in DNA. Our observations are that most of them are either neutral, in other words, they don't affect the ability of the person or the animal or plant to live, or they are damaging, in other words, they will cause disease or a loss or a defect. Now, our observations are is that there are far more defective ones than there are even neutral ones, and no one has come up with a good example of a clear example of a helpful mutation for evolution. Because for evolution to happen, you've actually got to add something, add a new structure or function, and take away a function that you don't want. So you can't just have one mutation adding a bit and saying that this has evolved. Now, our observations in the scientific world, in the medical world, is that the number of defective mutations or deleterious ones is much larger than even any potential good ones. So if you look at that over time, if you've got lots of bad ones happening and no good ones happening, you are definitely on a downhill run. So time will not help. In fact, time is the enemy of evolution, because more time will just get you further down the hill. It will just allow the bad ones to add up at the expense of any potential good ones, and we haven't observed any good ones. So genetic diseases and genetic disorders and mutations, they are very real, but they are absolute evidence that the human population and the world in general, all of the living things in the world, are definitely going downhill. So the real history of the world, as we often say in creation research, is very good, too bad, too worse. Now, it does end in salvation and glory, but that's nothing to do with biological processes. That requires the Lord's intervention. So if anyone would like to add anything to that from their own experience as well.
Sure. With Adam and Eve, you have created perfection in the genetic sense. God made everything very good, and that covers even the genes that determined Adam and Eve's characteristics. So by the time you get up to Noah, we can see evidence of slight mutational change. So in the naming of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, which are color names, Ham, Hebrew and Egyptian really for dark, Japheth, Hebrew for fair, and tracing them down through history, they give rise to the three distinct colorations of humans, which eventually multiply into many subvariations of that. Now, that's a genetic control factor. So therefore, something had happened between Adam and Noah, which was affecting the control of color factors in the body. So up until the flood, no evidence of other really serious genetic effects in mankind, except for that one. There may have been, but we don't know about them. But those three went on the ark. So don't be surprised. We get a dominant color separation after the flood, which may or may not have advantages. You don't go black because you live in the hot area. You can live in the hot area because you're already black. But we've discussed that in some of our races once. Now, later on, you see other genetic factors coming into mankind. So, Diane, your favorite is a lady who is listed as short-sighted. What's her name?
And it's one of the great unsung heroines in biblical history was Leah, one of the wives of Jacob, and she was actually the mother of the two lines that Joseph mentioned in the bit he did on biblical history. Remember, there was the priestly line and the royal line, which the priestly line eventually led to John the Baptist, but it was the priestly line that kept the system of sacrifices going until Jesus Christ came. And Leah was actually the mother of those two tribes, Levi and Judah. So very interesting real history there.
So she's listed as short-sighted. So something had happened to influence her sight, most probably genetic. And you'll notice also in the biblical history, the lifespan is dropping. That's again another genetic factor. So if your genes really won't work, sometimes you're eliminated before you exit the womb. Other times you are eliminated with a very short life. and many of these are genetic factors. So the number of mutations is increasing towards the present. So Adam, totally absolute genetic perfection, really, from our point of view. After the flood, a rapid increase, but it's not the families who carry all the genetic burdens across the flood, but they are increasing towards the present and are affecting our lifespan. So we no longer live as long as we used to. We have to really get our PhDs over and done with before you're 26, or there's no point. You don't live long enough to go back when you're 110 and do a PhD.
Thanks,
Abraham.
I'll hurry up then.
I was just going to say Abraham married his half sister, and there was no law against it. But a few hundred years later, God had given Moses the laws of not marrying close family members. That has to be because of genetic decline, basically.
Good thing, Craig.
No, good stuff. Well, we've only got about 20 minutes left, so I suggest that we go over to your bit, John, and Diane, gravestones and the like, before we begin to wrap things up.
Okay, I'll make just several comments, and then I'll ask Diane a few questions. That gives us just a couple of minutes spare. I'm going to read a passage out of Genesis chapter 3, where God is judging. After Adam and Eve have sinned, Adam is the originator of sin. Eve was tricked. I really do need to emphasize that. And you men need to stop blaming the woman for bringing sin into the world. Adam made that choice. Eve was fooled by a very clever and very brilliant serpent. And the word serpent is most probably meaning a colorful, beautiful looking, what we would call a dinosaur that had legs, and now the serpents don't. Okay, Genesis 3:15 and 16. God tells Eve, the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. He shall bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. Then in verse 16, God said something that most of us ignore. To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In sorrow you'll bring forth children, and your desire will be to your husband, and he shall rule over thee. Now, there's an interesting implication of that. If you look up the word increase and you look up the word conception, they refer to the number of kids you will have. So don't be surprised that one of the consequences we see as you move from Eve to the flood, from the flood to the present, is the number of children that people are having and animals are having is increasing. I'm pretty sure that for the year of the flood, the animals that went on the ark did not multiply and fill the earth, and Noah and his wife and the 3 sons and their wives didn't get pregnant either. So you're looking at another factor involved in this, and that is God's overriding plan in conception and in multiplication and in lifespans, etc. So Diane, would you like to comment genetically, medically, because your background is that, on what brings rise to death anyway? I'll throw in one more comment. I have collected photographs, thousands of them, of tombstones all around the planet, from ancient Romans right the way up to people in the outback. I visited the grave of Mr. Brumby in Tasmania and recorded it all. And the one thing I've noticed is the common belief that we're living longer and living healthier is simply not true. We used to live, even though it might have only been a small percentage. I went to a valley in Scotland. We're up at the top where the Roman mine was, and still is a mine display today. The people lived 160, 170. By the time you get down to the Industrial Revolution, the average age, because the kids all died, many of them, when they were young, but mum and dad, if they survived, lived to their 80s and 90s. So we are not living longer. But Diane, what is it that causes us to die?
Well, we go back to the question about mutations. We get to the stage where we can't repair our bodies. Our bodies are being assaulted, as it were, by the external environment, and also our normal cellular processes do produce waste products which are going to damage our cells. But we have repair processes built in. But eventually, even the repair processes get knocked out by mutations. So eventually, we get to the stage where we can't repair our body, and so we will die. And if you look at the biblical history in terms of those lifespans, remember Adam and Eve, or well, Adam specifically, we're given his lifespan. It was 930. Now, ultimately, the reason we die is because God told Adam that it would be a punishment for sin. And Adam and Eve sinned, and God carried out his punishment. God always carries out his word. But death is actually a physical process. So something had to happen to their bodies, and it did start straight away. But remember, we said their bodies would have started out perfect, no mutations, nothing going wrong, until God basically let the processes of normal biology happen. And remember, as part of the punishment for Adam and Eve, they were forbidden to have access to the tree of life. And I just wonder whether the tree of life actually had a function of keeping those repair processes going, because if the repair processes can keep up with the degenerative processes, right, you will stay healthy. But that is not what's happening now, and I suspect that that's what started to happen. But Adam was able to live to 930 because he started out with a perfect body with no mutations. These days, we start out with a whole lot of mutations which we have inherited, because there are mutations that affect just your own generation, just your own self, but sometimes there are mutations which will affect the ova and sperm, in other words, the cells that are going to form the next generation. And so we've all inherited a few mutations from our parents, who inherited some from their parents, and the number of mutations in the overall population is going up. So that's why time is no help to the theory of evolution. So we die ultimately because God gave the punishment for sin. Physically, we die because mutations are going on within our own lifespan because of assaults from the environment, chemicals, radiation, all of those things, plus the waste products from our own sort of biological functions, and loss of repair processes. Now, a lot of people do ask, well, people in the Middle Age, the average ages were in the Middle Ages or the early Industrial Revolution, the average age span was sort of 30 to 40. Surely we're living longer. Well, this is where you need to look at the statistics in their context. Yes, if you just look at the average, it was that low. What's happened is that now people survive longer because we can deal with the things that used to kill people early in their life. And perhaps I can illustrate that with a graph that I've got. If we could put that up, thanks, Joseph. That one
Just
graph.
bear with me. There we are, coming up now. Yep, there we go.
Yes. Okay. This is a series of graphs of what's called a survivorship, or the number of persons surviving to successive ages, or survivor graph. Now, what you're looking at here is if you start out with a cohort of people, in other words, a number of people who are all born within a certain time. So all the people who were born, say, in this case, 1851. But there are estimations of this that go further back. Now, if you take a cohort that are all born in the 1 year and then go through the successive decades, there will be a certain number of people who die in infancy. Now, in 1851, that was quite a lot, because there were a lot of diseases that we can now treat. So now they've been a bit fanciful here in this graph. They're going up to 2031. I think they're having themselves on. But if you just compare, say, the first line there, 1851, with maybe 1971, so we've got a bit of data from that, what happens is in modern times, apart from certain birth defects and certain diseases, certain infectious diseases. Most people survive those early years of infancy. Then they go into childhood and adolescence, and early adulthood are fairly disease-free periods these days. But back in 1851 or back in the Middle Ages, if you were injured or got some sort of infectious diseases, we couldn't treat those in those days, so you just died. So people tended to die earlier. But for those who survived war and pestilence and various other hazards of life, they did actually live to quite an old age. So there would still be a cohort left at 90 and 100, but it would be a lower percentage of the original cohort compared to what's happening now. Now, the people who made this graph are, I think, getting a bit fanciful in that they're expecting a lot of people to be living till 120, but it is possible. So if we could come back to us, and I think John has got some interesting examples from history, from looking at actual gravestones where you do have dates for how long they were able to live.
Give me the screen, Joe, just for a few moments, and then we'll throw it open to questions. A couple of comments, because there's some interesting comments on the chat on life and death, etc. We do need to remember a paper produced by the Russians when they were strong and atheistic. I saw it when I was studying genetics at Queensland University, and the comment was, we've looked at the body, it's got all the repair mechanisms it needs, so why do we die? And they ended up concluding, after discussing, well, some of them don't really work and some of them are busted, etc. There is no reason why man should die if we could fix up all the mechanisms. Now, basically, Diane has said something similar, but we can add something the then atheistic Russian government wouldn't. The fact is, death is a penalty for disobedience. And Adam and Eve, right up to the flood, environment stays the same. So their mechanisms, which started out perfect, slightly degenerated by the time of the flood, still repaired their bodies for nearly 1,000 years. After the flood, rapid environmental change, the changes in the repair mechanisms got worse and worse and worse. Lifespan drops and drops and drops, to the point where you get, say, in the last little ice age in England. I remember reading an Admiralty report when the wind all of a sudden changed, and instead of flowing north of England, it came from Russia right across the edge of France down into England, and thousands of sailors died in one day because they just froze to death on their ships, dressed as they were in those days. Now, no repair mechanism is going to deal with that. But you've got to remember, death is not just a physical phenomena, it's a spiritual penalty. And in reality, you've got the evidence in the gravestones about how long we used to live. So in that valley I was telling you about in Scotland, photographing gravestones all the way down the valley as we head towards the Industrial Revolution, where people move from the country into the city and work in the mines and the factories. What you discover is, well, one family had 12 kids. My dad comes from a Scottish family of 12 kids, but the family on the gravestone, 10 of them died before they were 7 or 8. Very common phenomena. So death was a constant reminder to them, and yet the 2 who lived, go down the valley a bit, they lived till nearly 100. So what you find is the lifespan wasn't affected greatly, but the average lifespan was, as Diane's graph actually says. And I noticed someone says, you're right, you can go and read the gravestones. Go and do it. York has got a whole lot of Roman gravestones in it, or coffins anyway. So go and have a look at some of these and see the ones that mention how long they lived, what killed them. So we've got data for thousands of years. We've even got it in the Bible about how long they lived, how many people there were, populations, etc. So today's subject is not something we're making up. It's something you can access across the whole of history. And there's one thing to finish with. Death is a penalty for sin, and there's no way out until the sin's penalty is paid. And that's why Jesus came, and he had to die. The wages of sin is death. That's the real reason we die. Not just getting cold on a British ship, not just running out of food in Alaska, not any of those things. They're all secondary. Death is an imposed penalty. And the good news that we all stand for is that you can have eternal life where you don't die again. And yes, you do have access to the tree of life in the new heavens and the earth, only if you accept that Christ has died in your place and you ask him to be your Lord and Savior. That's probably a good place to stop, Joe, and to get us back to the final thank yous and a couple of questions.
Absolutely. Let me just pull these up. We've got one or two thank yous quickly. A thank you from George Bond. And thank you very much for your prayers as well, George. And no, nothing to update as of yet, so we're still praying. Quick question from Shogiwa. Where do you get the 170 years old in Wales data?
It wasn't in Wales, it was in Scotland. On the gravestones.
There you go. One of the great things about having all the old gravestones and stuff in England, you can do this all over the place, as John said, from York, Norwich, all the way up the east coast as well, Wales as well, Scotland. Is a huge amount of this data recorded in the graveyards. Right, we've probably only really got room rather for one more question, and it's I think a bit of confusion in the chat as well. Some of the questions about immortality versus life expectancy, and the confusion I think comes over an idea that the less that we sin, therefore the longer that we live. And looking at an example of Adam, who one of the arguments is that Adam only sinned once and he lived 930 years. So that must be the length of time that the least amount of sin means you're going to live for that length of time. So maybe just a quick comment on dying you shall die and the effects of sin and the quantity of sin versus how long that you live. And really this question kind of is part of the sum up of some of the confusion. I think, what life expectancy would we achieve immortality if we keep increasing our life expectancy through being closer to God and repenting of sin? Is there any way that we can be getting rid of sin so that we can achieve immortality is part of the question, but how does that tie into life expectancy?
Well, I'll make one comment before Diane might want to add something. There is a regret in the psalmist who says, I looked at all the bad people and they were living long lives and they were doing well and they were rich and they were robbing and plundering and murdering. And then I went into the temple and I considered their end. So there's not necessarily a direct connection between how many times you've sinned. There's also another factor. God's looking at your brother or your uncle and saying, oh, that guy needs Christ. I've got to keep him alive a little longer till someone will tell him the whole gospel. So there's an overriding factor in all of this that you can't ignore. There's not a direct one-for-one correlation. Am I correct, Diane?
Yes, indeed. There are people who have lived completely dreadful lives in terms of morality, who have lived for a long time. And the old saying that only the good die young, well, it's not quite true, but there are plenty of good who do die young for various reasons. Now, only the Lord would know. However, if you want to live forever, you have to go to the person who enabled people to live forever in the first place, and that is the Creator. And of course, the way to do that is through the Creator himself, the Lord Jesus Christ, who came and gave his life for us all in order that we might live forever. And that is a promise that he himself gives, that if you come to him, you will have eternal life, but that is the only way. You need to have your sins forgiven and come to Jesus.
I'd like to add, reading something that Paul wrote in Romans. We all know this, we've quoted it many times, but it ends with something interesting. It says, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him, God, who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains till now. So all of creation is subjected to this. But this is what's interesting. Not only that, Paul said, but we talking about he and the fellow disciples, we also have who are the first fruits of the Spirit. These are the first ones to trust Christ as Savior. He says, we ourselves, where I lost it. I lost where I was at. I
23.
lost it, but he says we ourselves are subject to this futility in our bodies. So even those with the first fruits, the first ones to trust Christ as Savior, are having these same problems with their body. We're all under the curse of sin. And until that curse of sin is dealt with, as Diane said, by trusting Christ as Savior, it's all in futility. We're going to die. You can't extend your life just by saying, oh, God, forgive me. The forgiveness is you're going to live forever, but it's when you're redeemed in a new heaven and a new earth. That's when you're
Yes,
going to live forever.
that's a good point, Len. We don't want to live forever in this world, do we? Because it's so, yes, you can look forward to living forever, but it's only worthwhile if you can live in a new heavens and a new earth where there is no curse. And it specifically says that in the book of Revelation, the new heavens and new earth, there will be no curse. So the ground was cursed, remember, so other living things were affected, everything else was affected. So yes.
And who would want to live forever with Donald Trump as president, or Joe Biden still in the chair, or Kamala Harris?
I think that's about time to wrap everything up.
Yes, we look for a new heaven and a new earth in America to a new administration.
Yeah. I think it's about time to wrap things up. There's more questions, but don't worry, we will come to questions in our Q&A special, which we have in a couple of weeks' time or so. We're going to revamp and resort out Creation Conversations in terms of catching it all back up to date, with some of the topics being a bit here and there and everywhere. We should be back on schedule for next week. But until next time, goodbye, God bless everybody, and we will see you very soon. Catch you later.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Should finish off with the Queen.